أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. Welcome to this latest installment of our lectures on René Guénon's seminal work, The Reign of Quantity and the Signs of the Times. This lecture is devoted to Chapter 10, and indeed we have resumed these lectures after a rather long hiatus. So welcome to any new listeners or who have discovered or come across this series of lectures in the last several months. I hope, inshallah, to be able to complete this. This is a work in progress. There are about 40 chapters in this work, and we're going chapter by chapter. Chapter 10 is entitled The Illusion of Statistics. The fetishism of figures is a striking example of the totem and taboo, shall we say, of the moderns' faith of unbelief. And in this chapter of The Reign of Quantity, René Guénon sets out on a scathing critique of this modern myopia. Let us turn to the opening lines of this chapter. It begins on page 68 of this work, The Illusion of Statistics. His main point here is that the obsession of modern science with statistics, and indeed also probability, two very closely related disciplines of modern mathematics, are a direct outgrowth of the reduction of all reality to quantity. So he states in the opening sentence that the so-called scientific point of view, as the modern world understands it, the chief characteristic of this so-called scientific point of view is that it seeks to bring everything down to quantity, anything that cannot be so treated being left out of account and is regarded as more or less non-existent. Nowadays, Guénon writes, people commonly think and say that anything that cannot be put into figures, quote unquote, or in other words, cannot be expressed in purely quantitative terms, for that reason lacks any so-called, quote unquote, scientific value. So there is an identification of scientific value, or shall we say rigor, with pure quantification. And we find this, of course, in sciences such as physics, where mass is a number, typically expressed in kilograms, but also in grams, but mass is a number. Weight is a number, expressed in newtons. Temperature, expressed in degrees Celsius, is also a number. Distance, in kilometers or meters, or if you like, length in centimeters or what have you, is a number. Velocity is also a number, but it's a very peculiar one because it's a quotient of two different kinds of number, qualitatively speaking, namely of distance over time, or strictly speaking, displacement divided by time, because velocity involves both magnitude and direction in modern physics. We don't need to continue extending with these examples, but modern science, its very nature is one of quantity and quantification, and that's what people understand by mathematics today as well. So that if you want to go into science, or what is it called, STEM nowadays in America, science, technology, engineering, and medicine, STEM. You've got to be good at math. You've got to get a high score on this famous exam, for those of you who are not Americans, or familiar with the American system, the SAT, the SAT. There's a math portion, the quantitative. It's actually called the quantitative portion. You have to have a high score in that. So modern science is eminently concerned with quantification, but here, Guénon really would like to focus on statistics, hence the title, The Illusion of Statistics, but he has a very long preamble, and the word statistics is not even mentioned until page 71. Near the bottom of the page, there's only 2 paragraphs on page 71. It's near the bottom of that paragraph. Statistics is mentioned twice. And then over on the next page, 72, at the top of the page, he mentions the statistician, in other words, the practitioner or the expert in statistics. And then statistics is mentioned again twice further down. Statistics is also alluded to but not mentioned by name on page 70. And then afterward, he introduces and mentions explicitly probability. So before I'm going to sort of change my approach here, and I just want to get to the part in this text where he directly mentions, where he directly alludes, there's a direct reference to, without mentioning by name, statistics. That's again page 70, the second paragraph. So let me just read this. He says, the founding of a science, more or less on the notion of repetition, brings in its train yet another delusion of a quantitative kind, the delusion that consists in thinking that the accumulation of a large number of facts can be of use by itself as proof of a theory. Nevertheless, even a little reflection will make it evident that facts of the same kind are always indefinite in multitude, so that they can never all be taken into account, quite apart from the consideration that the same facts usually fit several different theories equally well. It will be said that the establishment of a greater number of facts does at least give more probability to a theory, but to say so is to admit that no certitude can be arrived at in that way, and that therefore the conclusions promulgated have nothing exact about them. It is also an admission of the wholly empirical character of modern science. So this is fundamental to understanding this chapter, but he only brings this in later. And we'll go back to the beginning, but I wanted to highlight this at the outset. What he is trying to say is that statistics represents a large accumulation of facts, and that these facts then are subjected to various computations, which are set out in modern works of mathematics. And if you've taken some classes in probability and statistics, you know what I'm talking about. Typically, there will be let's give a very simple example. For example, exam scores. They'll compile a huge listing of the exam scores in, let's say, a large university class. Let's say, in big universities, you may have 300 people in a class. Like large universities, like Purdue University, for example, or Stanford University in America. Very large universities have very large undergraduate classes, so you may have like 350 odd quiz scores or grade score or exam scores, and they compile them all, and they find averages and the median and the mode and the mean, which is also called average, and they compile these things, and they have graphs and so forth. So this is all an accumulation of facts, and then maybe in the case of an exam, it maybe tells you something, I suppose. But there's also a compilation of statistics, or again, facts, various kinds of facts, oftentimes in almost any kind of research, political research. There's statistics on every kind of subject today, in the health domain, for example. But what Guénon is saying is that there really is no repetition, so to speak, that facts are different from one another. But he doesn't give any examples, so I tried to think of some sort of an example. So let me offer one case that might help illustrate what he's trying to say. This actually happened to me. I had a conversation many years ago when I was a student at Princeton University with a physician. And this was a casual conversation. And at the time I was deeply involved in my studies and so forth. And then I mentioned to him something which I used to do to help my memory. And I think this is a good example. It may help illustrate other aspects of the things that he mentions in this chapter. So this is an old sort of thing which we hear about in India and Pakistan, where if you want to improve your memory, you should eat almonds. So there's this idea that you get a bunch of almonds, I forget the number, and you soak them overnight. And then in the morning you peel off the skin, and you eat those almonds and you drink the water. Now, this fellow was very much convinced of modern scientific means, and he thought that this thing which I was doing was just absolutely ridiculous. And
pseudoscience.
Pseudoscience, folk wisdom, what have you, folk medicine, and that was clear from his response. And then he said, well, this is actually very dangerous for you. And I said, why? He says, you're going to increase your cholesterol. And I just sort of smiled. Cholesterol used to be, maybe it still is a big thing. Every few years, these
the latest
doctors...
thing is like gluten now.
Is gluten now. So they come up with a new thing.
A new thing to stay away from. Which is weird because gluten is one of the fundamental ingredients in bread.
True. So every year, every few years, there's some new diet or some new thing which is pushed. And it's pushed by the entire social engineering apparatus of the media.
Yeah, just a way for them to keep churning out the same cookbooks and useless books.
Very well. So I sort of smiled and I said to him, you do understand that what you are advancing is merely an inductive hypothesis. Now, this was just over the head of this poor chap, and he had graduated from one of the most prestigious institutions of medical learning in Pakistan called the Aga Khan College of Medicine. And he didn't understand what I was talking about, and I said, really what you are saying is that this is dangerous to my cholesterol, although you have no idea about my medical history. You've never examined me before. Mm-hmm. And what you are going on is some study or series of studies in which they monitored the health of a bunch of people looking at this one variable without looking at anything else. And then on the basis of this accumulation of statistical facts, they make a generalization on those past experiences, those facts, for the future, so to speak, and apply this to other people. And I said, this is just not a means of arriving at any truly reliable knowledge. And he didn't understand that. And I said that any inductive hypothesis is falsified by one single counterexample. So I've done this for years. My cholesterol is fine. So this is an example, maybe, that helps us. That perhaps this is a good or suitable example.
So, in other words, what you're saying
to illustrate what Genon is trying to say. In other words, Genon is saying that that individual facts are characterized by a radical particularity, and so modern science, to the degree that it's based on methods of this kind, statistical and probabilistic methods of reasoning, it is then divorced, as it were, or very distant, at the very least, from transcendent principles of the traditional sciences. Traditional sciences are not based on this kind of statistical and empirical, purely empirical methods, because they are rooted in the nature of things. So let's go back then to the beginning of the chapter. And he says that, he wants to point out that he's dealt with this at great length already in the book. He says it has been made sufficiently clear in earlier chapters that this outlook, the modern scientific outlook, in other words, involves losing touch with everything that is truly essential in the strictest interpretation of the words. Again, this radical particularity that we have in statistics, or which is denied actually in statistics. In other words, each factotum, if that's a word, or each datum, each datum, the singular of data, is seen to be as identical as the next, right? So that even applies in exam scores, especially when as a professor, I can tell you that when you just have a bunch of these fake and stupid kind of exams that they give in many modern institutions of learning, if you really want to understand someone, you have to give an essay exam, whether that's written or whether you examine them directly, especially when they least expect it. Then you know what people actually know. But if you just put together these kind of what I call fake exams, like multiple choice exams and fill in the blanks and short answers and these Scantron exams, The guy may have a bad day. He may make a mistake, especially those scantrons. And oftentimes now, when you have these these exams that are mediated by computers, sometimes the mouse thing doesn't work. You type something,
you accidentally click.
You accidentally click something else. So these things are possible, and then also you can guess. And that's how they do all of these things. The SAT is done this way. Even these so-called advanced placement exams, as they call them in America, AP exams, because it's not graded by a person. So even though you may be a genius in calculus and you've done all of the calculations correctly, your work is correct, but then, because you're pressed for time, you circle the wrong one.
Yeah. And often
they do that on purpose because they'll make the answers often look very close to one another.
Yeah.
So you will, on your rough paper where you've actually solved it, you'll have it correctly, written out correctly, but because you're in a hurry, you don't notice, and they have a difference between plus and minus, because that can happen in mathematics. It's called a sign error. You lose all the points.
Yeah.
So maybe that's another, perhaps that's also an example. So this is an approach which involves, as Ganon says, losing touch with everything that is truly essential in the strictest interpretation of the word. Also, that the residue, he spoke of residues in earlier chapters, that the residue that alone comes with the grasp of such a science is in reality quite incapable of explaining anything whatever. But, he says after the semicolon, there is one highly characteristic feature of modern science that deserves further emphasis, for it indicates with particular distinctness how far science deludes itself about what can be deduced from mere numerical evaluations. And this is what he means by statistics. He means statistics and probability here, because statistics and probability really go together. So, for example, here's a classic kind of old style, I like math books, Schaum's outline of what is it, probability and statistics by Murray R. Spiegel. And then the same venerable mathematician has a whole other book devoted simply to statistics. So sometimes, they distinguish between these two, but they are very, very closely related areas of investigation in mathematics. So statistics and probability are deeply connected with modern notions of uniformity. So again, the denial of the radical particularity of not just static facts, shall we say, but also events. And I'll have more to say about that shortly. Events, the radical particularity of events, the qualitative nature of time and duration. So he says the tendency to uniformity, which extends into the natural domain and is not confined to the human domain alone, leads to the idea, which even becomes established as a sort of principle, only it ought to be called, he says, a pseudo-principle, that there exist repetitions of identical phenomena. But this, by virtue of the principle of indiscernibles, is no more than a sheer impossibility. He continues, a good example of this is afforded by the current assertion that the same causes always produce the same effects. And this, enunciated in that form, is inherently absurd. For there cannot, in fact, ever be the same causes or the same effects in a successional order of manifestation. Is it not quite commonplace for people to go far as to say that history repeats itself? Whereas the truth is only that there are analogical correspondences between certain periods and certain events. So, he is not saying that there are not really identical phenomenon in the sense that I have this lamp, right? On, okay, off, on, off, on, off, on, off. So yes, those are repetitions. It's the same sort of phenomenon, but from a qualitative point of view, each of those instances is actually different in the traditional, with a capital T, understanding of things. And this is the idea in the Islamic tradition, which is expressed in the Quran by the statement, كُلَّ يَوْمٍ هُوَ فِي شَأْنٍ, and every day he is involved in some affair. It doesn't literally mean day, people say, some people will interpret and say that it actually in every instant, because Allah or God, as they say in English, I don't really like the word, I prefer the term Allah, but anyhow, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is constantly sustaining the universe, and in a way he is creating it and destroying it at every instant. This is one kind of understanding in Islamic, the Islamic tradition, especially Muhyiddin ibn al-Arabi. He calls it the renewal of creation at each instant. But the word he actually uses in Arabic isn't instant. He says the Arabic is tajdidul khalq bil anfas, which means really the reanimation or resuscitation of the created order by breath. Because in Ibn al-Arabi, he has this notion of the divine breath, or the divine exhalation, if you like, a symbolic sort of language, but we don't want to go there too much. We'll get off topic. And this is expressed in the Sufi adage of La takrara fit tajalli, which means that there is no repetition in the divine self-disclosure or the divine self-manifestation. So God literally never repeats himself. You see this in things like the idea that there's no two snowflakes that are alike. No two human beings are completely alike, even if they are identical twins, and so on and so on and so forth. He speaks then also here of analogical correspondences between certain periods and events. Now, in ancient astrology, there is the notion of, again, cyclical history. This is a very important concept in Genon, but there are periods in history that are known as the conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn, which generally speaking take place every 20 years, but then within larger cycles. And astrology is the qualitative study of duration. It depends on which there are larger cycles, suffice it to say, without getting too complicated, that are greater than every 20 years. And there was this idea in ancient, even in ancient among ancient historians in the Islamic tradition as well, about particular Saturn Jupiter conjunctions, which would be the harbinger of epochal changes in the world. And so when a new kind of conqueror or sovereign would come to power, maybe inaugurating a new dynasty, or inaugurating, let's say, a new phase within a particular imperial dynasty, they would try and pass themselves off as, or claim, or try to say that they were the manifestation or representation or the effect, if you like, of a particular Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. And the word for conjunction in Arabic is qiran. So that person would be referred to as Sahib al-Qiran in Arabic, or in Persianate languages, Sahib al-Qiran, which means the Lord of the conjunction. So Tamerlane, such claims were made for Tamerlane, Taimur-e-Lank. Such claims were made for Shah Abbas of the Safavid dynasty. Tamerlane, of course, inaugurates the so-called Timurids. Similar claims were made. Same claim was made for Suleiman Qanuni, or Suleiman the Magnificent of the Ottomans. And there's a very interesting book that looks at some dimensions of this by someone named Azfar Moin. Azfar Moin. His book is called The Millennial Sovereign. And there have been other researchers in Islamic studies who talk about different dimensions of this. Like Catherine Babayan mentions this in one of her books. Evrim bin Bash. Cornel Fleischer. There are a lot of people who have mentioned in passing, but it's really Azfar Moin. But again, not to get off the topic. So every instant is supposed to have a certain quality of time. And in this regard, again, we already mentioned Ibn Arabi. There's an interesting passage, but let's just go back again to page 72 for a moment, where he mentions statistics. I'm sorry, I want to go to 71. second paragraph, he says, "It has been said that modern science, simply because it tries to be entirely quantitative..." No, excuse me. Sorry. Let's go back even further. I want to make the point. So if we go to page 70, I'm sorry about just jumping around, but I want to make the point. So if we go to page 70, that's where he first sort of mentions statistics without mentioning it explicitly. He talks about probability, and we read that already. And so after he mentions probability, or where he mentions probability, he says, "It will be said that the establishment of a greater number of facts does at least give more probability to a theory, but to say so is to admit that no certitude can be arrived at in any way, and that therefore the conclusions promulgated have nothing exact about them. It is also an admission of the wholly empirical character of modern science. Although," now we get to traditional science, "by a strange irony, its partisans, the partisans of modern science, are pleased to accuse of empiricism the knowledge of the ancients." So in other words, there's a repudiation that the knowledge of the ancients was rooted in any kind of transcendent principles. Of course, this is wrong, and Genon says this, whereas exactly the opposite is the truth. For this ancient knowledge of the true nature, of which they have no idea whatever, started from principles. He means principles of a transcendent order, and not from experimental observations. But they have this idea that it was all by trial and error. And these, miserable little Egyptians out in the desert through centuries and millennia of trial and error figured out how to build a pyramid and do any number of other astounding things.
This is also how they tend to interpret Aristotle as well.
Yeah.
That he was just a biologist.
Just by trial and error.
Yeah, he was just like opening a bunch of frogs and figuring it out.
So he goes on and he says, "So that it can truly be said that profane science is built up exactly the opposite way around traditional science. Furthermore, insufficient as empiricism is in itself, that of modern science is very far from being integral." Mm-hmm. So the empiricism of modern science, again, is not integral because there really is no unifying principle of a transcendent metaphysical order to bring about any true integration of any of these fields of modern knowledge, since it neglects or sets aside a considerable part of the evidence of experience, the very part that has a specifically qualitative character. For perceptual experience cannot, any more than any other kind of experience, have a bearing on pure quantity as its object. And the nearer is the approach to pure quantity, the greater is the distance from the reality, which nevertheless is supposed to be grasped and to be explained. In fact, it is not at all difficult to see that the most recent theories are also those that have the least relation to reality and most readily replace it by conventions. So in modern science, they have all sorts of conventions and all sorts of fictions. These fictions are alluded to on page 70, at the top of page 70, and in footnote number 1. So in modern physics, we have a frictionless, massless pulley. You have a frictionless, almost massless rope. You have all sorts of, people who have studied these subjects in modern high school and university and college, they know this. So there's these various kinds of simplifications and so forth that are brought in. And yet they reject the experience of the ancients. And so, for example, that thing I was talking about with the almonds earlier, that's just rejected as, superstition, or at best as folklore, and, in a no less pejorative sense,
right,
folk wisdom, folk practices.
And somehow a perfectly elastic solid is not...
Perfectly elastic solid.
That's rational somehow.
Well, I mean, even let's say in physical chemistry, there's something called the ideal gas law, but there is no ideal gas. And, if you really want to do things, that's why there's a huge difference between the way engineers and theoretical scientists do things, because the engineer actually has to go out and build the thing.
Right.
So, for example, when they design rockets or guns, anything that involves explosions to make a projectile go somewhere, you can use the ideal gas law, you can use all these things, but they're only an approximation. I mean, even what they talk about, you study about conic sections, and they say that, well, in ballistics, a cannonball, or when you fire a round and the bullet comes out, that it follows a parabolic trajectory. It's actually not true. It's not a symmetric parabola, because there's 1,000,001 things involved. There's air resistance, which they don't talk about, and even if it's a rocket, whether it be a rocket or a bullet, there is wind. And then depending on how far it's going, there's lots of other forces, the rotation of the Earth, many things come in. And all sorts of fictions are introduced. So there really is no such thing as Cartesian space and time. You don't have a specific point in space. You never do, because there is extension. So you can't idealize the motion of, let's say, a rocket or a bullet or a Chinese weather balloon, whatever you're talking about, as a point which is reduced to its center of mass. That's a fiction. That's an abstraction.
So
the flight of an arrow.
Is it all just approximations then, for the most part?
Those kind of problems that you do in college and university physics are approximations. So, for example, when you talk about the ballistics of firearms, there's a huge amount of, again, empirical data. And it's never, again, that also is an approximation, because every instant is different.
Yeah.
This is known by snipers, for example.
Yeah.
In terms of the actual, what's called the external ballistics of a projectile. The external ballistics is what happens after the explosion has taken place in the barrel, and what is called the bullet has emerged and is going toward its target. So these problems are, they're abstractions. Anyhow, so he goes on, emphasizing this radical particularity which modern science tries to cover up, and points out again that another of the limitations of modern science is that it only relies on this one method. So the greater part of reality, which is the qualitative dimension, completely eludes it.
They have no account for it.
Right.
No way to account for it.
And so, if you're talking about projectiles and, I don't know, reactions of some sort of chemical, potassium perchlorate or whatever it is, maybe this will be fine, but it becomes very complicated when you talk about human beings.
Right, in the medical sphere, for example.
Not just in medical, in behavior. So he says this on page 71. This is more particularly the case. In other words, this neglect of the greater part of reality, or how the greater part of reality eludes modern science, this is more particularly the case when facts within the human order come under consideration. For these are the most qualitative of all that modern science regards as included in its domain. Science is determined, nonetheless, to treat them exactly like other facts, such as are concerned not only with organized matter, but even with matter in the raw. For it has in the end only one method, which it applies uniformly to the most diverse objects, precisely because by reason of its special point of view, it is incapable of perceiving what are the essential differences between facts. I had another interesting experience in this regard. I remember years back when they actually tried to compile statistics on Muslims in America. This was many years ago.
Yeah.
Very early days of the internet, when people still would call you on the phone, and they got my number from somewhere, called me up on the phone, we're doing a survey on, the attitudes of Muslims in America. Were you interested in, answering some questions? I thought it should be interesting to see what these people say. So obviously the person didn't know anything about Muslims. He just had a set script, and he was asking these questions, which were supposed to be sort of yes or no answers. Well, he called the wrong person that day, and so he would just ask some question, how do you think about this? I said, well, I don't really think it can be reduced to a simple, polarity of this kind. I always gave these sort of answers, and he was just pushing. He said, well, can you just tell me what? I said, no, I can't, because things are actually quite more complex than this, and you can't really make generalizations like this about people, and so on and so forth. And he was asking all of these questions that have been put together in a very, again, simplistic way. Oversimplification, that's the topic of the next chapter. So this is what they do, but it works to an extent. Why? It only works to the extent that human beings are more and more, shall we say, alchemically processed and turned into ciphers through social engineering, brainwashing. You know, what Jacques Ellul, where's the Jacques Ellul books, talks about the systematic vacuity of the individual.
These are classic books.
These are classic books. We've mentioned them before. We mention them all the time. The Technological Society and Propaganda by Jacques Ellul. Very interesting. So the more and more you believe the myths of modern times, you know, the less critical thinking you have,
the more simplistic you become.
The more simplistic, and the more you fall into it, and the more accurate this whole statistical game then begins.
Right.
And the means of modern manipulation are truly sinister with social media, and this is very interesting, data mining. So it's not really until very recent times that AI, so-called artificial intelligence, has become so big. You think, wow, this is really amazing. You know, how did you know, on YouTube they give these predictions. Again, how is that done? It's on the basis of your behavior. If you have an account on YouTube, they see what your viewing habits are.
You click on a certain video, it takes note of that.
So you watch a bunch of videos on I don't know, gardening.
Yeah.
You get a bunch of videos on gardening. And then the more data they have, the more things they predict. So,
but it's not really intelligence because it's
not
based
intelligence.
Off of my behavior.
Same thing for Netflix suggestions, Amazon books, Amazon
totally
Prime,
relying on
whatever.
human behavior.
So that uses huge amounts of data, which they weren't able to process in this way until relatively recently.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a huge amount of data. That's a huge amount of statistics. And then they use probability and statistics. And it's not very... This is actually relatively recent mathematics. They call it... There's Bayesian probability. There's different kinds of probability. Things in probability. It's actually not very sophisticated. But what is sophisticated about it is the sheer amount of data that is involved. And that's why this ridiculous thing called ChatGPT... What is it called?
ChatGPT. Yeah.
It's absolute nonsense. Because it's again based on statistics. So the way Google Translate works, if you don't know this already, it wasn't because a bunch of geniuses in linguistics sat down and put together some amazing killer app, you know. It's all based on statistics. So you need a huge linguistic corpus of German and French and Kazakh and, you know, Azeri and all these different languages that are offered. You need a huge linguistic corpus of every kind of text. And then you type in something. And all it does is scan that huge amount of linguistic data that it has. And it's just actual usage. It doesn't know what a verb is. It doesn't know what a direct object is. It doesn't know what... It has no idea.
It doesn't understand.
And then it just predicts.
Yeah.
And so the fact that Google, if you have a Gmail, they read everything, right? So they read every sort of... And now it starts completing your sentences for you. I find that really annoying. I hate Gmail.
Yeah.
Right? They do that same thing like on Microsoft Word, one of the most disgusting programs ever invented by in the history of mankind by that deranged individual Bill Gates and his sick company. Mm-hmm. All of this stuff is based on, again, statistics, and they call it artificial intelligence. Man, one of the... You know, do we really need Noam Chomsky to tell us this? Mm-hmm. Very overrated man, actually, I think.
Yeah. Doesn't go far enough, ever.
Never. Anyway, we could talk about his linguistic theories, although I don't want to get off topic. But he apparently wrote a recent op-ed in that absurd American newspaper called the New York Times. I think that's what it was. I haven't actually read it. I saw, of all things, it was one of these YouTube. It was actually a very funny YouTube video. You know these guys, Sagar and Jeti and Crystal Ball.
Yeah.
On Crystal and Sagar.
Breaking points or something.
Yeah, they were reading out of it, and it was very funny. Because, you know, Chomsky, even though I'm critical of him, he's a very accomplished, well-read person.
Yeah.
So in that article, he uses the phrase Borgesian. It's a reference to Jorge Luis Borges, very important writer.
Yeah.
And neither Sagar nor Crystal ever. And she's like, what is this word? Bargesian?
Oh my god.
So,
Yeah.
And then of course Sagar quickly, searches, he was a philosopher. He wasn't a philosopher, you twit.
He was an author.
He was an author. Founder of magical realism. Anyhow, so Chomsky is saying that this is not intelligence. And what these AI people do not understand...
Well, now that Noam Chomsky said it, we're allowed to believe it.
Well, what they don't understand is that this is nothing. This is a dead machine. It's an algorithm. The algorithm is written by a human being. And moreover, the point is that you'll never have artificial intelligence because the thing does not have a soul.
Yeah.
It cannot cognize universals. So what does it do? Again, it's the radical particularity. It has all of these facts. It accumulates them together. And then based on a probabilistic model, it predicts what words go where. And that's how Google Translate works. That's how what's it called again?
ChatGPT.
GPT works. Yeah. So this is another example of the madness of modernity and statistics and probability. So just to recapitulate, he says, and it is above all in the human order, whether in the field of history or sociology or psychology or any other kind of study, that could be named at the fallacious character of the statistics. And this is the first mention of the word on page 71, to which the moderns attach so much importance becomes most apparent. Here, as elsewhere, statistics, second mention, really consist only in the counting up of a greater or lesser number of facts that are all supposed to be exactly alike. For if they were not, so their addition would be meaningless. And it is evident that the picture thus obtained represents a deformation of the truth, and the less the facts taken into account are alike or really comparable, or the greater is the relative importance and complexity of the qualitative elements involved, the worse is the deformation. Nonetheless, the setting out of figures and calculations gives to the statistician, as it is intended to give to other people, a kind of illusion of exactitude that might be called pseudo-mathematical. But in fact, without its being noticed, and because of the strength of the preconceived ideas, almost any desired conclusion is drawn indifferently, from such figures, so completely without significance are they in themselves. The proof of this is that the same statistics in the hands of several experts, even though they may all be specialists in the same line, often give rise, according to the respective theories of the experts, to quite different conclusions, which may even sometimes be diametrically opposed. Now, there's a very important book. Came out a long time ago. In fact, it was published in New York, W. Norton Company in 1954. It's by Darrell Huff. It's entitled How to Lie with Statistics. So statistics just provides this patina of, or this veneer of exactitude, and people think it's very scientific when you introduce statistics into your discourse, and this is really a hallmark of the modern mentality, this fetishism for figures.
So in other words, the accumulation of facts, what they call statistics, this really doesn't have anything. It's not making a claim on anything that is required by the statistician. So in other words, what is required is a massive leap on the part of the statistician, right? To try and draw some conclusion according to these facts.
Yeah.
But that is always going to be informed by whatever ideology they already adhere to, which is why we have, like he says, conclusions that are diametrically opposed.
This is another reason.
Like a Marxist who's looking at the same amount of facts is going to be totally different to a fascist, for example, if we want to go down that line.
On some kind of, on some particular data set relating to economic data, for example. Yeah. Very true. And this is why modern science has such a bias against traditional sciences. Let's say what they call so-called alternative medicine. So they say, well, no, you have to do these statistical studies, you have to do these double-blind studies, and but for example, people who have resorted to acupuncture, they know that it works and they don't care about the studies. Or Chinese herbal medicine, for example. There are many, many instances of that. But again, they say, well, we haven't done these studies. Well, how could they have figured that out? And again, it must be centuries of trial and error, so, maybe they have some good remedies for, just indigestion or something, they might say, just by way of example. Yeah. But if you say that, no, they actually have very profound healing modalities in what's called TCM, traditional Chinese medicine, or Ayurveda, or the system of Islamic Galenic, in origin anyway, medicine, which is practiced in India and Pakistan, called Unani Tib, or any number of other so-called indigenous systems of medicine, which I'm not familiar with. They're based on some sort of principles. And, let's just stick with Chinese medicine. They talk about hot and cold and moist and this and that. They talk about different organs. But when they talk about kidney or lung, it doesn't really mean the kidney as an organ that we know it. It's a whole sort of complex system. And if you read these works, and traditional Chinese medicine is now very accessible because many very good translations have been made, and you can read the ideas and the philosophy behind it. You can even refer to such seminal works as Science and Civilization in China by Joseph Needham, and you can really see how the qualitative dimension is very important there. It's not all a bunch of numbers. And the really accomplished Chinese doctors, as in other systems of traditional medicine, they just take a few that look at you. They don't have a bunch of big machines and all this stuff. They'll take your pulse, look at your tongue, look at your eyes. There was this doctor when I lived in Malaysia, Chinese doctor from Nanjing, and his English was terrible. The only thing he knew how to say was acupuncture and herbs. That's the only English he knew beyond hi and hello.
Right.
And you would just, anytime I had a problem, I'd go, he'd take my pulse on both wrists, look at my tongue, and then he'd just write some stuff. And I would always ask him, so, what do you think? He would just say, acupuncture, herbs. And that was it. Lie down, tick, 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 puts a bunch of needles in you, writes a bunch of stuff, gives you some really weird stuff. You go home and boil it, drink it. Always worked.
Every time.
Yeah,
I remember recently, there's two things, right? I went to a chiropractor because I hurt my back while playing basketball.
Yeah, right? So chiropractors also are supposed to be frauds, right?
And he was feeling my back, right? And he's like, so how'd you hurt it? And I'm explaining the story, and before I could finish, he's feeling the lower back. He goes, okay. Anyway.
He didn't want to hear the rest of it.
Didn't need to hear it.
Yeah.
He knew exactly where the problem was. He could feel that it was misaligned somewhere near my lower back.
Yeah, so that's experience. That's apprenticeship. Yeah, exactly. That's practice. And that's an understanding of principles of alignment in the body and so on, right?
Yeah, and all of these systems of medicine that you mentioned, the ones in Pakistan, Ayurveda, Chinese, all of them adhere to a principle that some people have called like vitalism, right?
Vitalism, yeah, they do.
This idea that living organisms are like fundamentally different from non-living entities because they contain some sort of non-physical element or are governed by different principles than
inert matter,
inanimate things.
Yeah.
And oftentimes they would call this vital spark or energy or elan vital. All of these are just different terms for the soul. That's the main
psyche of Aristotle.
Distinction of humans from a flower or a vegetative soul or an animal soul, right? And what you'll see with doctors now is they'll say, well, human beings are just animals. We're all just a bunch of apes, and a pig is smarter than a 5-year-old. And they have all these weird facts now because they don't see human beings as fundamentally distinct to animals. They think that we are somehow living, we are somehow similar to them.
I think there was a major book on this by Mortimer J. Adler.
Which one?
It was about the distinction within human beings. It has the word distinction, I think, in the title. We need to track that down. But anyhow, I just want to give one last example here to illustrate what he says. So back on page 72, as he's wrapping up, he makes a reference to modern astrology and how already in his time, and this was quite many decades ago, right, when this book came out,
1946.
Yeah, that there was a kind of statistical approach that people had adopted to try and, shall we say, legitimize or domesticate astrology for the modern world, where it would just be reduced to delineation of personality on the basis of, oh, well, let's do some statistical studies on, and so we've got all these statistics on Capricorns and Taurans and Leos and, you know, people who are born under a particular sun sign. And so he denounces this, and I'm not going to read out the thing, but we can blame this on a guy named Alan Leo, who lived between 1860 and 1917, according to what's on the Wikipedia page for him. He really is the inventor of modern astrology and the destroyer to some great extent. And it's only, you know, in modern times, people like Robert Zoller, people like John Frawley, people like Olivia Barclay, who sort of tried to revive traditional astrology, especially through the works of William Lilly in English. So this also ties in with what he says earlier on in the chapter, where he says that there really is no such thing as the repetition of identical phenomenon. And I mentioned how that applies in the realm of time, and how each instant has a particular quality. So there's a very beautiful passage in a very short work called Mystical Astrology According to Ibn al-Arabi. And this is by the traditionalist writer Titus Burckhardt, who I think wrote very interesting works on traditional science. He has a very interesting book on alchemy. But this is a very, very short work, which is based on his readings of the works of Ibn al-Arabi, but it has a very beautiful foreword by Keith Critchlow, where he addresses this idea about the qualitative nature of time. So let's just, I think this is an interesting passage. We'll just read it by way of concluding today's session, or this lecture. He says, as the term astrology means the practical application of astronomy to human use, our response to it must necessarily hinge on our understanding of what it means to be human. What is that favorable moment which the Buddha urges us to grasp? It's an allusion to a saying in the Buddhist corpus of texts. Why does he congratulate those who have seized their moment, and lament those for whom the moment is past? The explanation lies in the traditional view of time. Illumination, or the goal of human existence, is instantaneous in relation to the long cosmic journey of passing time. It is a comprehension of reality which comes in a flash like lightning. This favorable moment, or paradoxical instant, suspends duration and places the recipient into a timeless present. This timeless present is paradoxical in as much as it is qualitatively different from that elusive, profane present that barely exists between two non-entities, the past and the future, and apparently ceases with our death. Neither does the profane experience have any bearing on the prolongation beyond time that the favorable moment brings, which can be likened to a glance outside of time. Beautiful. For those of us who have been educated in the values, quote unquote, of modern Western industrial culture, the traditional view of time is as difficult to grasp as is its unfoldment represented by the traditional symbolism of astrology. So astrology is a symbolic science. It's one of the very deep traditional sciences which has been very much eclipsed and in decline in our times, but it has not completely disappeared. And it seems that Genon was of the view that it was pretty much gone. Maybe that was his own experience. That is not my experience. I think there are many competent practitioners of it who remain in the world, in the Islamic world in particular, in the Indic world also. They are not necessarily widely known. But it's a very significant symbolic science. And in traditional civilizations, for example, in Islamic civilization, in the practice of Sufism also, there are particular times of the year, particular times in the, shall we say, liturgical or sacred religious calendar, which are given great importance. We are about to enter into the month of Ramadan, right? In Ramadan, there's a night called the Night of Power, Laylatul Qadr. There are other times in the year that are also acknowledged in other cultures and civilization. Recently, we just had what's called the spring equinox, right?
Right.
Which is known as Nowruz or Nowruz. And that is traditionally the time when the sun enters into the constellation of Aries, into the sign of Aries when it's at 0 degrees Aries, and that's supposed to be a time when the world sort of supposedly resets, or at least this is the traditional teaching.
Right.
And
Spring was always symbolized as a
renewal, rejuvenation.
Yeah.
You have an idea, even as
in Chaucer,
for example, in the spring.
Yeah. Fresh May.
But then you see how this is totally overturned in the modern world.
Right.
With, I think it's Eliot. T.S. Eliot. The Wasteland. Spring is the cruelest month, he says. So there's a complete overturning of the understanding of what spring is. And so this was considered a very important time where people would perform certain rituals and do certain prayers and so forth, and depending on which particular Sufi tariqa and so forth you're involved in, there's certain things to be done at that time. And then there's also when the sun continues in the constellation of Aries and reaches its it reaches its exaltation degree, which is the 19th degree, which would be 18 degrees of Aries, because you start counting from 0. So it's ordinal, not cardinal. So there are many things like this. And then there are other sort of astrological configurations when you have this aspect or that aspect that are more auspicious or more favorable for certain kinds of ritual actions. So this notion...
What does all this have to do with statistics?
All of this has to do with statistics because they say, well, this is just a bunch of data. And there's no particular instant. It doesn't mean anything. It just means, if the sun in Aries at 0 degrees Aries is just a measure, which they don't use anymore, but it is a measure of celestial longitude. So if you project what's going on, again, you're taking as a mathematical model a geocentric perspective, and you project that 3-dimensional image onto a 2-dimensional page, and it just says that the longitudinal position of the Earth on 360 degrees is at 0. That doesn't mean anything. It has no qualitative dimension. But for the ancients, even let's say the ancient Egyptians.
So in other words, they say this doesn't say anything, you can't interpret it in any way. This is just a bunch of facts.
No, but for the ancients, this is
exactly what they do.
Not clear. This is not at all... Sorry, for the ancients, this is not at all what they believed. Of course, now things have changed a lot in Egypt. There's a new museum, but in the old Egyptian museum, upstairs near... at the exit point of the mummy room, on the upstairs, when we took you there, there was this very interesting bowl, or vessel, because it wasn't round at the bottom, it was flat at the bottom, something like a flower pot. It had all these ornate markings inside. It was a very ornately designed water clock, and every instant of time had a different hieroglyph and a different marking there, because each instant of time has a different sort of angel or angelic entity associated with it.
Wow.
And in traditional astrology, every 10 degrees, they're called the decans. So the Egyptians had that divided up. There was a particular planet that dominated for each particular 10 degrees of each sign, and each sign is 30 degrees. So you'd have 3 for each. And then you have astrological hours, for example. In a particular day, there's a particular planetary hour. So this is a whole symbolic science. And then if you bring in other symbolic sciences like Ilm al-Jafr in Islam, you have the Arabic letters. The Arabic letters have a particular, again, symbolism and qualitative nature, and then there's a way of converting them to number, and that, again, number is not just pure quantity. So the word Allah, for example, in the system of Jafr and Abjad is 66. Well, that has a particular symbolic meaning. This is a whole area which the moderns just think is just a bunch of nonsense. And many modern Muslims as well, and we'll see how that works out in the next chapter in what's the name of the chapter?
Unity and Simplicity.
Unity and Simplicity. So many things could be said. We need to wrap this up. So we'll just conclude this chapter on the illusion of statistics, where he talks about how, again, you have this notion that all facts are identical, this uniformitarian kind of tendency. And you have to understand that all of these ideas are related. And so he says these ideas all hang together. The desire for simplification necessarily accompanies the tendency to reduce everything to the quantitative, and it reinforces that tendency, for obviously nothing can be simpler than quantity. If a being or a thing could successfully be shorn of all its distinctive qualities, the residue thus obtained would indeed be endowed with a maximum of simplicity. At the limit, this extreme simplicity would be such as can only belong to pure quantity, being then the simplicity of the exactly similar units that constitute numerical multiplicity, a point important enough to warrant more detailed consideration. So that leads into the next chapter. So this tendency toward extreme quantification, this
necessitates simplification.
Yeah, this absurd emphasis on statistics, probability, and so forth, leads toward a kind of simplification, or I would maybe prefer to say oversimplification, but a reduction of things to quantity leads to a complete sort of obscuration of reality.
Yeah, anything that's qualitative,
right?
Which Genon would say is reality.
Is reality, yeah. So it leads in very nicely to the next chapter, and so we'll just end it there. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you in the next chapter. Thank you.